watching people sitting in the back. And there's still a couple of very desirable seats up front if anyone wants that. Very nice, comfortable swivel chairs. Good evening on this June evening. Can you
hold it
closer to me?
I don't think it's on.
I don't think it's on.
It's not projected.
I think
It's on, but it's not very loud.
Try holding it like it is.
How do we, Meredith, you know how to set it a little, one punch louder? I don't know.
It is
It is
on.
on.
It is
What?
on. It is on.
It's on?
if it's not.
I've never needed to, I don't know, I've not been in charge of the microphone before, so I'm not sure if there's something that needs to be done on the speaker.
When we tested it, it turned on.
It is on. I just, but I don't know if it's amplified enough for people in the back. I'm holding it very close. Okay, let me know if you can't hear. My name is Bill Zirinsky, and my wife and I have owned Crazy Wisdom Bookstore since 1989, and we renovated this space a year ago, and we've been doing some public events in this rechristened Crazy Wisdom Celestial Lounge. It's obviously no longer a tea room, no more tea service, and we're just happy you've all come to see Gaia Kyle tonight and participate in what we hope will be a dynamic conversation with Gaia. And I just also thought if Chandra was here, I would introduce her. And her, I also just want to introduce for a second Chandra Mitchell, who is the manager of the store since we reopened. And she is truly running the place, and she will be running the place even more. And Meredith Evans, who is helping her as a senior staff person, also helping to run the store. And this is a really nice turnout, and I'm really glad to have you all here tonight. Want to just mention for those of you who are not familiar, little plug. We continue to publish the Crazy Wisdom Journal, which we've been doing for 30 years. It is both print and for people who mostly read online. It's also online as a blog and as a flipbook edition. And so it's available both seasonally and every single month. There's a Crazy Wisdom monthly edition which adapts some of the articles for the monthly and also has some new content each month. So Gaia Kyle has been living in Ann Arbor, as far as I understand, maybe for 45 years or 44 or 46, somewhere right there. And I've known him casually and vaguely for many of those years. And I can't think of anyone in the wider Ann Arbor alternative community, which I would define as countercultural community, political progressive community, integrative medicine, holistic health community, land preservation and conservancy communities, Green Party political communities, organic food and agriculture, and good eating and nutrition communities. And I'm leaving out a few. And I wanted to have an evening where Gaia could talk about his new book, Menu of Hope, Alternatives to the Food That is Destroying Our Planet, but also talk about his journey, because I think the people who are here tonight might find it a kind of dynamic conversation at this particular point in time to see how it all weaves together. And so thank you for coming. My intent is to ask you questions, but also give you a chance to talk about the book and your years in being in these different communities. And also, I really don't want this to turn into just talking to or at this group. I'm really going to look to you and look out at you to ask questions and make comments, so it's a fun, interesting conversation. So I'm sure I could add much more to the introduction, but we can save that for questions and other pieces. So, Gaia, welcome to Crazy Wisdom. I'm glad you're here. Thanks. You can use this as you need to see fit.
Yeah, and I mentioned to Bill that I wanted to start off by honoring the gone before ones. And certainly that includes, in this part of the world, the Potawatomi and Fox peoples, whose lands were taken through the process of genocide, and back into that world again. But I thought some about my Ann Arbor elders who have moved on, sometimes physically to other places in the world, and sometimes to the other realm, as we say. And I just wanted to read their names in honor of them. So, Red Moon Song, Rich Ahern, Henrik Skolimowski, Linda Diane Felt, Max Hyrick, Bunyan Bryant, Z. Gamson, Kiwe Denokwe, Carolyn Finney, Autumn Kraft, Richard Cleaver, Marius Mason, John Rose, Elise Bryant, Luther Buckley, Jim Jones, Sarah Warber, Chris Kuhn, Larry Fox, Anne Marie Coleman, Toby Hannah Davis, Lynn Hadley, Marion Else Olson, Ann Blackwell, and of course, Shaky Jake Wood. It's an incomplete list, but people who have touched my life, and I think in some way all of our lives are fluid in that sense, that we're influenced by lots of people, and that's how we become who we are. But I wanted to at least honor some of those folks, all of them who are elder, at least by a couple of years to me, and several of whom have passed away, but all have left town one way or another. Okay, better mic stuff. Anyhow, I don't know if you want to start with questions or if I should.
Yeah, I'll start with a few questions. That stimulates something, which is, I took some names down. I want to ask you about a few of them in terms of what they inspired in you and how you think of their legacy to all of us in Ann Arbor. Tell us what Linda Felt has meant to you in the years.
Well, I think I first met Linda back in the 80s, right? And Linda was a mainstay of the holistic health community here in town. And I, for a brief period, actually apprenticed with her, learning some massage and some cranial sacral stuff, and but she was also, she was briefly partners with one of my close friends through the co-op I lived in. She was on the board with the food co-op, at the food co-op with me during my first part of my tenure there. I think she may be the only other person who had done a 10-year stint on the board.
Wow.
That's something.
I think of Linda in terms of, among other things, as you said, a pillar of the community and someone who served on the board of the food co-op for a very long time. I'm curious, how many people in this room have had body work or healing sessions with Linda Diane Felt? Wow, yeah. And I concur with her being on the list of yours, because I can't think of anyone who's passed away that I think of more on a monthly basis than Linda Diane. So I love that you've called her up, and look how many people here she also did work with and healing with. Will you talk a bit about Sarah Warber?
Sure. Sarah Warber, I originally knew through an organization called Minniskittican Drum, which was organization started by the Native American elder and ethnobotanist Kiewit Inokwe, and through my involvement with the drum, I met Sarah, and Sarah and I worked on starting the Complementary and Alternative Medicine Research Center at U of M, which was a NIH-funded center, alternative medicine research center, and Sarah was one of the co-principal investigators, and I was a research assistant working under her for a while. I guess that's the.
Does she live in London now, or where does she live?
I'm not exactly sure where she lives, and she retired and she moved out to the country, and then I think she may have moved since. I'm not sure.
The contribution that you and Sarah Warburg, Linda Diane Felt made, and Rita Ben made, others to the Complementary and Alternative Medicine Center. For those of you who don't know, it really has had a big impact at the medical school in Ann Arbor over the last 20 years. Has anybody here been following, and maybe you have, Gaia, whether it is continuing, whether it has sort of gone dormant, or what's the story with that?
So I think that, the research center was a 5-year center grant. And at the end of that 5 years, elements of it turned into the integrative medicine, and I had already left, so I don't know all the iterations of it, but I think there's some things still in the Department of Family Medicine that are sort of, well, I know that Susie Zick is still there, who was one of our original collaborators, if you will.
Yeah. Important impact when you think about it in this town, because it was an example of the University of Michigan accepting and confirming and bringing aboard as part of the education of young doctors and young nurses an appreciation for integrative medicine and alternative medicine. It may be matter of fact to 23-year-olds in town, but it wasn't matter of fact 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 30, 35 years ago. Again, I love that you kind of called up Sarah Warburg and the contribution that she made. I'll come up with one more right now, which is Max Heyrick.
Right. I remember a friend of mine in East Quad when I was an undergrad, took this class, Western and Non-Western Medicine. He was very influenced by it and inspired me to take it. And so I did, and I think in many ways that started my journey. I don't think I gave that class the effort it deserved, but that's probably true for many students in many classes. And Max was, in many ways, a mentor to me, also politically. Max was a sociologist, although people often think of him through the alternative medicine world. But his thesis was about this called, I think, Spiral of Conflict, which was about the free speech movement in Berkeley. And that was very near and dear to Max's heart. And in that way, he and I were kindred spirits, that we were both engaged in this realm of alternative medicine, whatever that might mean, but also very concerned about the politics and radical politics and politics of creating change and so, right, I had the good fortune of having some closeness with him.
Yeah. He certainly mentored 40 years of people in this community in a variety of ways. Among the people that Gaia mentioned, anyone here in this audience want to say anything about anyone else that was mentioned where you felt like, oh, I'm just happy to hear that person's name called up? Yes, go ahead.
Different, Toby Hannah Davis, I haven't heard of her in 30 years, so it's nice to hear of her.
And who was she?
So she was an activist. I think she was. I think her involvement was through the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice. But she later became on city council, and I remember there was some tension, as happens when one enters politics, between, you're responsible for the drains, and the people who wanted you there want you stirring up stuff. But I did have the opportunity. The only piece of legislation that I've ever been involved in writing, actually, was and Toby Hannah Davis helped and helped us get through, was maybe some of you know the name Mumia Abul Jamal. This is a African American freedom fighter who was, I'll say, framed for killing a cop, and he was on death row and was supposed to be executed, and there was a global outcry in the same way that similar outcries have happened around other freedom fighters in the past. I think of Sacco and Vanzetti and Joe Hill, people who were facing death and but in this case there was some success, and some of that success came from city councils that passed proclamations that said, we think he should get a new trial because the first trial was so corrupt, and so I worked with Toby Hannah Davis on that, and I certainly knew her and worked with her on other things, but that was a project where she and I worked together, and she was really wonderful. You couldn't ask for more from a politician. All due respects to politicians.
How many of you here know that Gaia ran to become a regent of the University of Michigan when he was all of 23 or 4 years old?
I did not know that.
Doesn't that take chutzpah? What was the motivation at that particular point in time?
I didn't do a very good job of it, but yeah, we were, we meaning the student movement that I was a part of, was actively fighting the arms race in our little corner of the world, which means weapons research here at the University of Michigan. And we would routinely show up at the regents' meetings and during public comments say what we could and scowl at them the rest of the time. And so I mean, it only made sense to try to get in or use that, since they were the hindrance to what we wanted. We wanted the expansion of a policy that said that classified research couldn't be used to maim or kill as a primary purpose. It seemed like all research shouldn't be able to be used to maim or kill. We were not successful, and neither was I was talked into Sherry Bullard, who was the secretary for the student government, talked me into running as a Democrat, which means going to the Democratic convention and swaying enough people to vote for you, and that wasn't going to happen. But I did go through the process and learned a little bit about Democratic Party politics, but yeah.
I'm going to come back to some of these interesting historical pieces because they really reflect really an exceptional dedication on Gaia's part. I'd like to give you a chance to talk a bit about the book, and so I'm going to let you do that, and we'll interrupt with some questions here and there.
Yeah, well, I have not, normally I've talked a couple times about the book and I've sort of prepped a bunch, and I have not, intentionally not prepped today about the book, but I'll give you a quick overview of the book in 4 chapters. The first chapter really looks at the climate impact of animal agriculture, and struggles with how do you measure that, and there are some really different measurements, and if you take the one end of the equation, it becomes almost all of the greenhouse gases can be accounted for by animal agriculture. The one paper I refer to talks about, I think, 87%. That's quite a bit. And now, if that's mind-blowing, it's because it takes into account the use of land. And land that's used to grow cattle is not land that could grow forests, much of which once did grow forests. And many accounts of climate impact say how many trees were cut down this past year. But if you say how many trees were ever cut down, then the impact becomes much, much greater. I don't actually come down with a final, this is what I think is the right number, and I don't think it's really about numbers, but it's about looking at what are the pieces that we're measuring and how do we measure them. The second chapter looks at what are called the planetary boundaries. We had been living in something called the Holocene, a period of time that was really well suited for human flourishing. People now talk about the Anthropocene, the period that has been changed by humans and now we live in. And the 9 planetary boundaries are boundaries that have been described that of various aspects of our environment that have an impact on whether we're in the Holocene or out of it. And the 6 that have been crossed are all largely crossed because of animal agriculture. That's land use, that's nutrient flushing of phosphorus and nitrogen into our waters, that's loss of fresh water, that's extinctions, and it's the role of what's called novel entities, which really are chemicals that I heard one person talk about them as space alien chemicals. They didn't exist on the planet 150 years ago, and so we're talking pesticides largely, but other things fit into that category. And time and again we see animal agriculture is the reason that these things are such a force. So how do I manage to, after that, how do I get to call it the Menu of Hope? I think many of my readers don't don't get to the third chapter. So in the third chapter, I outlined 4 approaches to thinking about this. Again, not with an eye towards saying this is what I think is the right answer, but towards saying how would we think about it. And the first area to think about is how could we do agriculture differently. And unfortunately, and this is where I feel like well, I think it's a really important message, and I always feel like I'm a troublemaker believe it or not, I occasionally feel like a troublemaker. But when I bring this up, right? And that is that as I looked at things, you hear a lot of talk about grass-fed beef and regenerative agriculture, which is a lovely idea, but it turns out that it may not, in practice, be such a grand plan. I'm not saying that there isn't a place for truly regenerative agriculture that tries to regenerate soils and and if animal agriculture is part of that strategically, there may be a place for it. But when we talk about, and grass-fed is really an incomplete word because all beef starts out eating grass. It's grass-finished beef, and grass-finished beef, unfortunately, grows slower, and so its lifespan is longer, and its weight is less at the time of slaughter. And so that means you have to have more cattle, which means all the problems that cattle cause, you have more of them. And how much more? If we talk about it, flip it on its head, efficiency, right? The efficient way to finish beef is to feed it grains where they grow quickly and so on. The grass finished stuff is something like 56%, only 56% as efficient as the grain finish. So that's a huge difference. And that's before we even take into account the methane that grass-fed beef produces a lot more than the methane produced by grain-finished fed beef. So I'm not saying that there's a specific way that, I don't think we know the answers, right? I don't think we necessarily know what's the best way to raise beef. Certainly there's a problem with CAFOs, and there's a problem with huge manure lagoons and the failure to use whatever manure is produced in an efficient way. But the what's the word I'm looking for? The hype around grass-fed, I think, is really dangerous and problematic. I talk in that section also about some other agricultural things, that it's possible to do regenerative agriculture without without animals. That you can, there's compost strategies and there's other things. Well, get the book and read it if you want to know. But certainly this is not a guide for agriculturalists. I'm not pretending to be that, but I want to put out some suggestions about some things to look at. The second approach that I talk about is the high-tech approach, and I may be a little too focused on what's called precision fermentation and cell-cultured agriculture, but I look at those things, and I'll just say a little bit about precision fermentation, which is you get microorganisms to produce a molecule, and in this case, whey, the dairy molecule, has been produced and has gotten to the point where it's produced efficiently enough that it is that Breyer ice cream makes one ice cream product, not all their ice cream, but one ice cream product that's a whey-based ice cream that was grown through precision fermentation. And we may be on the brink of a revolution. We may not be. I was just this morning actually talking with a friend of mine who did precision fermentation using algae to make a specific nutrient that's a more high value nutrient, right? And he was saying, I'm not sure that this will ever come online. On the other hand, there are sometimes cost curves, so it's an approach. The third approach is really healthy nutrition. And we have I think a wonderful guide for this in what's called the Eat Lancet Commission. Lancet being the medical journal out of Great Britain, and they commission people to say what would the optimal diet be for human health and for the health of the planet. And it's a diet that's, surprise, surprise, mostly plants. It cuts animal consumption in about half. And again, if we're talking about an equitable distribution of things, remember that Americans eat a lot more animal product than the rest of the world. And so that's even more so for us. And we can look at, would it be worth going further than just cutting animal consumption by half? And I think that there may be some health benefits to that, and I think that that's a fine ideal, but at the same time, we want to make progress how we can. And the Eat Lancet Commission talks some about how a major public health campaign could make some changes.
Can we stop there for a minute and see, because Gaia has just been sharing quite a lot of information in a very concentrated way. And I wonder if anyone has a question or a comment at this point, either about the Eat Lancet Commission or about any other of the issues that he's been raising.
I do have comments.
Yes,
But I
please.
don't feel this is the time to do it because I haven't heard part 4 yet.
Yes, and I wondered whether to kind of go before part 4. If you want to do part 4, then we have
Because,
it.
my whole way of being is about honoring the intelligence of nature.
Yes.
And that when we say grass-fed beef, there's a supplier, an Amish supplier of raw milk that goes on at co-housing, and it's been going on for 20, 30 years or more, and he calls his beef salad bar beef because it's not just grass, it's all those herbs, these flowering plants that bring chemistry. Many of them are medicinal, and they change the quality of the meat. And that, there are people who are documenting that, but that doesn't get into the mainstream stuff, or it's poo-pooed because nobody is thinking about complexity. And one of the things you always say about nature is complexity. And we're trying, it sometimes seems like we're trying to reduce it to something simple and easy instead of surrendering to the complexity and being blown away by that. But if we will become partners with nature instead of controllers, then a whole different way of being opens up. I mean, this is, what you're talking about is global. It's not just global. Anyway, but I appreciate everything you're saying. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I very much value that way of thinking, and I think one of the things I struggle with is that it is global, that we are looking at a globe with 8 billion people on it, and that we want to both look at the whole, the big picture, and I certainly paint with a broad brush, and from those broad patterns, we also have to say, well, little things happen here and there that are sometimes important, and certainly, one of the things I talk about is the scale of a farm, right? And the majority of farms in the world are pretty darn small, and they're feeding, a small group of people, and they're really important. And sometimes animals may play an important role in them, and sometimes those animals may have a big impact on the environment. And I don't think we've figured out the solutions for the 5 million farmers who are subsistence farmers, and some of whom whose lives depend on animals. They happen to be more efficient farmers by and large, although again, if they're only raising their animals on salad bars, or what have you, the animal will grow slower than if it's given the green burger as well.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
an oversimplification.
Yeah, no,
And I don't want to go into more detail.
which is fine. Yeah.
Before Gaia goes to section 4, any other comments or questions at this point that you want to just kind of bring in, or? Okay, go on.
Oh, well, yeah. So approach number 4 is just I love the term ethical vegan, because it always gives me the opportunity to make fun of the unethical vegans who are running around there, stealing people's pocket change and whatever. But people use the term ethical vegan, meaning they're a vegan because they care about the ethics around the treatment of animals. And so if we use that lens to look at things, what do we get to? And great respect for the activism of animal activists and vegan activists. And the fact of the matter is, it's hard to use ethics alone to move things, and I wish it was not the case. But even in my own life, sometimes ethics alone doesn't do it. But and in that section, I talk a little bit about departments of ethics that were surveyed compared to other parts of universities or other academics, and the ethicists, the majority of them recognize that there's something bad about eating meat, eating animals. But only about 25% of them didn't eat animals in the last week. Similarly, lots of people, about 10% of the population has been vegetarian at one point or another. But, and again, according to this same survey, only about 2% are. And so I think that sometimes ethics can be helpful in terms of making changes or helping people hold on to changes once they have made them. But it's important to recognize that that's not the whole of the formula. And that's approach number 4. That gets us to the last chapter, where I really talk about, in a loose way, policy and projects, and ultimately action and activism, and the need to translate the book is not a change your diet and you'll change the world book. I mean, yes, if everyone changed their diet, it would change the world. It's change your diet and use that as a tool of leverage to make other changes in the world. And that's I'm hoping is the message of chapter 4.
Can I play with that just a bit? How many people in this group are currently vegetarians? How many of you have been vegetarian for 20 years or more? Any of you been vegetarians for 40 years or more?
Question,
Yeah, go ahead.
where do you put eggs and dairy?
Right. So certainly, when I say vegetarian, I'm talking about diets that can include eggs and dairy. And if we get into broader conversations, we can talk about semi-vegetarians and so on. But when I use the term vegan, the way I use it, I have a slightly technical meaning for it, but roughly I mean people who aren't eating animal byproducts as well.
So I'm going to ask a little more about that. So Doug, over there, you've been a vegetarian for more than 40 years, you said. I happen to know you, so I know that that's the case. Tell us what originally caused you to become a vegetarian, and how what's your attitude about being a vegetarian now? And I want to ask one or two of the other longtime vegetarians, just to create a conversation about that a bit.
I think it was a sliding reasoning. You know, it started out just that it was, you know, hip and everybody was becoming a vegetarian. And then more along the lines of spiritual development, and, you know, it wasn't really ethical, it was a little more religious, I guess. And then eventually just, you know, well, why would we do that to animals? So that was my reasoning.
And the gentleman who just got up a minute ago, you also have been a vegetarian for a long, long time. Want to tell us about what originally, what was the root of that, and then as it's evolved over the years? Sorry to put some people on the spot, but I'm just trying to create conversation that involves us all.
It just made sense. I was thinking globally what was needed, and it was fewer animals as food. And it was easy to do, by the way. And it really expanded my, what do you call it, cuisine or something. It became a lot more interesting. Eating the same animal, you know, a couple times a week, it was pretty boring. And it really expanded my cuisine, whatever you want to call my diet. A lot more interesting being vegetarian than it is.
And Beth, what about you? You raised your hand.
I was 13 and I read Francis Moore Lepay's Diet for a Small Planet. And I thought about the math, feeding this many people or a much smaller amount of people grain, or using the land for plants rather than for animal agriculture. But as I said to my mother, even as a 13-year-old, I was mostly vegetarian, except for corned beef, because I was Jewish first and vegetarian second.
Probably didn't last too long.
Someone else want to say something about their own kind of path with
I'll
veganism
I'll
or
just
vegetarianism?
add in at that point, actually, and maybe this says something about why we've had Beth as my partner, if anyone doesn't know, but such a long and loving relationship. Is actually Francis Moore Lepay's book was my first foray into vegetarianism also.
Bronwyn, were you about to say something?
I wanted to make a comment about it not being as black and white as that for me. I grew up in England with food rationing, and you got a pound of meat was your ration for a week for a family of 4. so you had a little slice on your plate and the rest was vegetables. And I had no problem with that. And then I ate whatever was coming down the road, and I came here and experienced people eating an amount of meat I couldn't imagine. I was served a plate with a steak on it by a Texan that was, I mean, it would be like 2 weeks supply of meat. And then I was married to a meat eater, very heavy meat eater, and when I got divorced, I became vegan. I became a macrobiotic for 7 years, and then when I was going through menopause, I needed to eat some animal protein, so I started eating fish, but I didn't go back to eating, a lot of animal foods. And then, and then I was an ethical vegetarian for many years. And then I realized that, my children at this point were not vegetarian, and I just became more relaxed about it. And I try to pay attention to the sourcing of the meat I eat and how it was raised, and I always say thank you to the creature, but I'm not, at this point in time, a vegetarian, though I eat a lot of vegan food. So I'm trying to put more nuance into that, and I honor the people who've been consistent, but I'm not.
I think Gaia speaks to that in his book. You want to say more about that?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, I think we need a diversity of strategies
Yes.
and approaches, and certainly I think if the Eat Lancet Commission is sort of big science's nutritional recommendations for the world, I think you epitomize, and Bronwyn, to the extent that I have known you and know of you, I think you epitomize small wisdom recommendations around nutrition for the world. And I think that, my efforts with this book were really to try to do the science piece.
Yes.
And I really think it's important to recognize and honor that science alone isn't the whole of the picture, and that we do need wisdom that sometimes doesn't, the randomized controlled trial doesn't necessarily capture each individual person in that trial.
I wanted to say I'm not a vegetarian, and I just finished your book today, Gaia, even though you're a very important person in my life, and I was very proud of you for writing a book, because I knew that it was going to challenge me to change my habits. And I live with my beloved partner who grew up with meat and 2 vegetables, and that's what she likes. And the things that you said that really spoke to me, one was about a plant that travels very far, still has less of a carbon footprint than a cow that was raised locally. Like, that was a very powerful thing to me. And, sometimes I just think about making sacrifices in my life, and it's like, it's not going to turn the tide if I become a vegan. So, like, personal integrity, I make certain choices, but it's very convincing what you had to say. It really is, and it's leading me towards really reconsidering some of my food choices.
And as I say in the book, to become a vegan on this planet is a drop in, a drop of water. But if you can use whatever changes you're making as a leverage to talk to friends about the fact that you're making those changes, or come together with other people and support them in making changes, or better yet, going to, all things I would like to do here, going to the school board and saying we need better nutrition in the schools that are based on the nutritional powerhouses, which are the fruits and vegetables. You know, or to challenge the worst of the agricultural practices, or to do education around, you know, some aspect of some of this, or to, you know, form a group. And I'm, you know, having written the guidebook, I think of this sort of as potentially almost a primer for animal agriculture critic activists. So, you know, I'm looking for the people to come forth and say, yeah, I want to join a group with you. So, just, you know, putting that out there. Yeah.
My partner, she's always saying to me, you know, why do you have to get that chicken salad at Liberty, because it comes in a plastic container? And I've always had a hard time with that, what you were just kind of talking about and what you're talking about now, which is taking the small things that I could do, and they seem so small compared to the planetary situation. And I've been unsuccessful with that. And yet what strikes me about your really remarkable career of activism in so many areas is you really always believed in the small actions that you do in each area, and what is the ripple, what is the reverberation, how does that make a difference? Can you speak to that?
Well, I have a sort of framework that I think is maybe particularly helpful in the current political moment.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, simply that, you know, if you take action, you have the potential of making things better, or keeping things from getting worse, or keeping things from getting as worse as fast. And we may well be in that last section now, but, you know, everything happens in the world of humans because humans have done the things to make them happen. Oftentimes it's lots of people doing little things in out-of-the-way places, in, you know, second floors of bookstores, or in backyards, or coffee houses and so on.
Will you talk about the 3.5% concept that you talk about in the book?
Sure, I reference it. You know, there's, and I'm forgetting the person's name at the moment, but this sociologist essentially, who was looking at, you know, how do tyrannical regimes come to an end? And she was pretty sure at the beginning that it was
Chenoweth?
Yes, right. Erica Chenoweth. She was pretty sure at the beginning that it was through the barrel of a gun, and she got challenged by some peace studies people to that wasn't the case, and she took an honest look at it and found that in fact no, it's really more often nonviolent resistance that brings about change. And she, as she looked at places where this had happened, she came up with this 3.5% rule, that if 3.5% of the population persistently, actively resists it inevitably leads to the downfall of the dictator. I think that this rule can be misinterpreted to mean, oh well, if we just get 3.5% of people on board, anything can change. It'll always change. And I don't think that's exactly the case. I think that though the principle, never mind the number, is the case that if you get enough people behind something, that's one of the pieces of changing things. You have to know what you want. You have to have a movement, right? I mean, again, I grew up in a movement household, right? My folks were anti-war activists and civil rights activists. It was called the movement back then, right? And when people get on board, change can happen if you get on and you get enough people and you're persistent enough. And I don't see why we wouldn't want to try that.
Yeah.
Someone want to say something? Looked like there was a.
I
Go
would
ahead.
like to say something. I've personally seen the small things that you've done impact the people. Even I'm a vegetarian now, and I have been for 2 years because of you, pretty much. Because you raised your son vegetarian, and that, like, it's interesting and just inspiring to see how you have spent your life trying to make these small changes, and it really seems that you've done and accomplished a lot with those.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things that I think that one of the people you mentioned was, and I may pronounce his name wrong because I always have, you mentioned, when you mentioned people, was Luther Buckley, who was the key person in the Ann Arbor area in terms of the cooperative movement in town, the ICC co-ops, and so on. And I once myself incidentally did a story about him. That's another really important thread in what you've been doing all these years, both in the forming of your 40-year-old cooperative that you're part of, but also involvement in community and cooperative activities. And I'd love you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And Luther is someone who, I mean, I probably was in the room with him once. He's not someone who I really knew or was closely involved with, but knowing of his work and his presence and his impact on this town had an impact on me. Luther was the executive director of the, or the general manager, I'm not sure what they call it, of the ICC, the Student Housing Co-ops. I remember even sort of late in his life, he had already left the ICC for retirement, but he was talking about creating elder co-ops. You know, certainly, well, you mentioned, Bill, in your introduction of me, involvement in countercultural.
Yes.
And I was actually thinking today, because I know this is going to be a talk about, or conversation about my life writ large, and I think that counterculture is actually a decent way of describing how I approach the world, right? That we live in a culture that's often a death culture, that's often a rape culture, that's often a white supremacist culture, that's often economic exploitation culture. And I'm often looking for strategies that are counter to some of those trends. I could go on with some of those trends, you know, emotionally stilted and etc. And I see in the co-op movement a struggle to try to create a world and to practice in what sometimes is called a prefigurative way, the building of a world that's not economically exploitive, that's egalitarian and equitable and can also be joyous, and community building.
What a co-op accomplishment the ICC has been. It wasn't just 2 or 3 co-ops in this city. I believe ICC consisted of 17 different co-ops in the community. And the cooperative movement in Detroit, Fred Thornthwaite's cooperative community, I forget what it was called.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they had dozens of cooperative housing units all around Detroit, and a cooperative optical thing, and they were housing a number of thousands of people in their heyday. I don't know their
Yeah,
current
they
status.
still are.
but
They
still
are amazing. They're in many states. There are these large senior living centers that are, providing affordable housing to elderly folks. There's some in the Detroit area, some in Kalamazoo, and I forget the states, like 5 or 6 states that have these essentially apartment buildings. Yeah.
Very impressive.
Yeah.
Really very impressive. And did you, do any of you live in co-housing in Ann Arbor? Did you raise your?
Co-ops,
Co-op,
ICC.
ICC, and co-housing up the one on, off of,
Yeah,
Jackson
I lived
Road?
I lived in the ICC for a number of years, and then at Haywa, and then I lived in co-housing, yeah.
Oh, yeah. But the reason I'm mentioning co-housing is because that was really the germ of a an idea of a few people, and then doing all the work, all of the groundwork that became part of creating that and financing it, and then, creating rules and procedures and methods for people to keep communicating with each other as they ran it together. And so, just interesting. How many of you are aware that Gaia ran for sheriff of Washington County, aside from Beth and Beth's mom? Some other? That was interesting. Tell us about running for sheriff. At the time, what were you running against or for as a sheriff?
Well, at the time, we had just gotten ballot status for the Green Party.
Yes.
I had worked, I didn't want the job, I well, I didn't want that job either, but I would have taken it. But I had, was looking for a job, went to the want ads, found, I was a young nurse, I found an ad, nurse wanted, I called it up, and lo and behold, it was the county jail. And I said to my friends, I can't work at I don't believe in jails. And my friend said to me, there may be some interesting opportunities for, maybe you want to look at, So I tried to be as subversive of a nurse in the jail as I would drop and then hockey kick these little cookies that they had in the lunch area for the staff under the doors of the solitary confinement, things like that. So I had worked at the jail until they got rid of me. Which that's also it's an interesting story. And so, it seemed to me that the Greens didn't, I didn't see a whole lot of opportunity in running for president, frankly. Not me, but any of the Greens were not going to win the presidency, and in fact, lots of people still hold a lot of resentment towards the Greens for, well, they should equally hold resentment towards the Socialist Workers' Party, I think it was, got enough votes that if they had all gone to Al Gore would have won, and he never talks about that. But it's not like you're entitled to those votes. But I'll skip that whole conversation unless someone really wants to go down that road. But it seemed to me it made more sense to start at the bottom, to try to find smaller offices, and and I think the other thing is a campaign is an interesting opportunity to have a conversation. I didn't think I was going to win the sheriff's office even then, but I did think that I could have some interesting conversations, and we tried to have conversations about marijuana laws, and we tried to have conversations about racial profiling. And you know, it's interesting. I didn't realize at the time Washington County had a Republican sheriff who was actually fairly decent. He was very community minded. The folks at Safe House loved him. He worked really well with them. And he was actually collecting stop data, you know, about cop stops to try to make a case or you know, to at least look at is racial profiling going on. And that led to his opponent, the Democrat who was running against him, trying to stop that. And his opponent actually won. And I think I didn't understand all of that at the beginning. If I had understood that, I might have run a very strategic and powerful campaign that might have been able to shift that election, elect a Republican who we would have been glad we had elected. Anyhow,
But some changes did take place in the sheriff's office, because I know we did a story in the Crazy Business Journal about the fellow who was the sheriff for 8 or 10 years, who was African American sheriff,
so he
quite
was
progressive.
So he was the one who came after. You know, that was an election cycle after the one that I was.
But you were raising the conversation, or the conversation was being had.
Yeah.
Comments, questions, other things? Caroline, what's on your mind as you listen to this?
I'm really impressed with the richness of the culture here.
Yes.
It really is amazing. I'm looking for cooperative senior housing. And you were talking about it as though there are a number that exist. I'm only aware of 2 in Michigan. One is in Grand Haven, Spring Lake, and the other one is farther north. But there may be different organizations. I'm looking around at the ages of other people here, and I'm surprised that there aren't more variations on senior housing that's intentional in this area. And if anybody cares to speak to that, I'd be very happy to hear about it.
I think what we were talking about is CSI, which was I think Cooperative Systems Inc. And at one point they had an optometry group and various other things, and they settled in on building you know, affordable senior apartments. But yeah, there's a lot of wonderful culture that also was lost, and that I really mourn in some senses what was lost in Ann Arbor. There was, when I moved here, a cooperative herb shop, a cooperative produce store, a cooperative, the People's Food Co-op had 2 storefronts. There was a cooperative tofu business that I worked with for a while. There was a cooperative bakery. And maybe most important, there was a cooperative warehouse that serviced other cooperatives around the state. And I think that was possible because a lot of people, and we're back to that idea of the movement, you know, who were part of the movement, said we're not gonna spend our money at the capitalist place, we're gonna spend our money at the people's place, the people's co-op. There's a lot of water under the bridge over the years, but I think a lot of for whatever reason, there isn't that sense of we all need to do our part, and that means be a part of the alternatives we want, or the change we want, or the world we want.
That's great. I'd like to ask you about the current status of the People's Vote Co-op and what you know, but I first want to ask Rebecca, what brought you here today?
Well, to hear Gaia talk about this book, which I've not read yet, but I'm interested in it, and yeah, just finding out about more of the alternatives that I might have, because I still eat meat, so maybe looking at other ways to approach that. And curious to hear more and learn more about, because I do try to eat regenerative meat, that's locally grown and all of that, but maybe that's not enough.
What can you tell us about what's going on at the food co-op at this point? It doesn't seem to, it seems to be struggling.
Well, I'm not the best person to give an update, but to the extent I can tell you that the People's Food Co-op just got a new general manager, and had a transitional general manager for a while who was hired from a co-op organization, was someone who had a lot of skills, and I think there are some interesting positive changes that may be happening, that may be upping the number of shoppers, which is part of what you need to make a co-op run. But the co-op, without a doubt, the co-op has been struggling for over a decade. I think there's some strategies to get out of that. They're currently doing a fundraising drive.
Capital campaign.
A capital campaign, yeah, exactly, to try to upgrade some of their things. That, although we love the location also has its limitations, particularly as a store. It's rough when you have to carry, goods from the basement up to the first floor to stock things. It would be much better to have a gravity-fed system where you can bring something down from above. But that's the limitation. It's hard to do things when your coolers are too old and so on. And so they're hoping to upgrade stuff, and
And with the new construction of that new building where the parking lot was near Carytown, there's even less parking nearby, which always mattered to some segment of
that's always been a concern for many, and I think the co-op's biggest shopping base are people who live and work close to it. But I'll remind people that after hours there's usually decent parking, and on weekends there's decent parking, and it still is the people's store.
Other questions or comments? Anyone want to raise anything? Do you want to raise anything else or talk about any other aspect that you want to make sure you have just kind of touched on? Doug?
So, you said earlier that you were a nurse. I don't know if that's been your day job.
Yeah, I'm a nurse practitioner.
Okay, so where do you find the time for all this acting? I mean, really, in a busy, professional life or whatever, work life, I can't do it.
Well, so let me talk about the virtues of living cooperatively. I mean, you know, certainly for much of my life I've been able to live on the cheap. My partner and I have both made choices to live, to work part-time. And
To be employed part-time,
well,
that's different than working.
well, I'll make Jean help me sing. My life is more than my work.
Your work is more than your job, yeah.
Yeah, but you know, so, but I also haven't done the things I've done alone, right? I mean, but I haven't done the things I've done alone. We currently, speaking of co-ops, the co-op that I've been a part of for years, first Haywa House, and then, which has had various incarnations, and then it expanded into the 3-house Spring Collective. Well, the central house, about a year ago, fell apart, and so then what do? You can either say, well, that was a nice project, or you can rebuild, and we're trying to rebuild, and so we're looking for, you know, vegetarian diet friendly, doesn't have to be a total vegetarian, activist oriented, don't have to be in the streets, but have to have a sense of it, you know, appreciation for an activist culture. People who are, you know, cooperatively minded and oriented, and we now have a lovely group of about 3 or 4, and we're moving towards looking for 6 people. So but it's hard to find people, and I've found that that's been more and more the case for a lot of people for a lot of reasons, which sometimes means I start projects that don't get very far, and then they fall apart, and you start other things and you try different things.
You're very resilient.
Well, I guess. Yeah.
But you know, I didn't even mention this, but I want to give you a chance to talk. Just as an aside about this, in addition to being a nurse in the practice that he's in with Dr. Malcolm Sickles that they do together, he's also doing psychiatric medicine. Am I right that you've begun in the last few years? And so that's a whole nother piece that he's doing in his busy life of his.
Now it's gotten to be a problem. My job is getting in the way of my work. If you're going to say that, I have to say, psychiatric medicine is rife with problems, and psychiatric drugs have some serious issues associated with them that often get blown off or looked over, and not the least of which is when you don't need them anymore, sometimes they're very difficult to get off of, and so as I've been about 2 years working for this therapy practice doing mental health prescribing, I've increasingly taken an interest in helping people get off of psychiatric meds that they can't get off of because they get brain zaps, or they get nauseous, or they get sick, or they get suddenly weeping spells that they never had even when they were depressed, or and it's all withdrawal, and so I'm very interested in helping people with those issues, and so that job is taking more time. I also do some, just whoever comes in the door you prescribe for, whatever your passion is.
You wanted to ask something or comment?
I did want to say that I did get a chance to read the book, and I thought it was excellent, very well researched. It was just packed full of really interesting information. So I want to thank you for that. But I'm wondering if this is going to be part of a larger effort, or will this be a standalone effort?
let me take a moment to put the ideas of the book in context. I'm of the opinion that, well, I think probably many of us are of the opinion that we're in a really disastrous place in terms of climate and the environment. A lot of work is being done on that, a lot of really good, important work, particularly around the energy transition, which is super important. And we probably, as we speak, we're probably seeing the cusp of coal globally. And we're probably, if we're not there yet, probably soon going to see, rather than every year more and more carbon gets put into the atmosphere, that beginning to level off and decline. Because of the hard work of a lot of people, and because of lots of forces. And it doesn't seem like it's quick enough. We're looking at, I've seen numbers as high as 1 billion refugees, 1 billion climate refugees coming in the next decades. And with 8 billion people, that's an incredible disaster we need to work on. It seems to me that, and it has seemed to me for a long time, that the animal agriculture part of the equation allows us to imagine a strategy or strategies, approaches as I call them in the book, that might give us a little more hope, that might, if we could figure out how to shift things globally. Right now the trend is more meat is being eaten every year. More people are, as more wealth is generated, more people are getting into eating more meat globally. And if we can figure out a way to slow, stop, and reverse that, that may give us another glimpse of hope. So, as I said, I think of this book as a potential, it's not perfect. As the author, authors are probably usually more aware than they often let on about how imperfect some of their works are, but I'm aware of some of the shortcomings it has. But I think of it as a decent primer for animal agriculture climate activists. And in terms of a broader project, I don't necessarily see another book. I may do some other writing, and might even put out another book on something else, but not in conjunction with this. But I do hope that I can use this as a tool to connect with others who are interested in doing activism around these issues. I actually recently spoke with a lovely woman from Minnesota who does talks for Climate Reality about agriculture and so on. So anyhow, so I think that's the piece that, how do we build this into an organization, a movement, a strategy for change.
Who else has a question or comment? Beth, can you take a picture of the two of us up here on stage so we can post it, make it seem like we actually do some things here? Crazy. Snap away. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I hope we was enriching and interesting. And thank you very much.